Okay, colleagues. So, I kind of wanted to start slowly and maybe go over some of the things I talked about last time, but I kind of cannot resist the temptation to read you a certain quote. So we begin talking about society today. And in a second, I'll talk about this in more detail. I think there are ways of looking at societies from a natural perspective. Yeah. Apparently, not everything is set up yet. In the sense that it seems that when we're talking about animal societies, if animals have a society, it depends on your definitions. But when we're talking about maybe animal societies or early, I don't want to say primitive. Let's not say primitive. Let's not be judgmental. When we talk about early human societies, it seems that maybe psychology, some basic psychology and basic biology would be enough to explain their behavior. Now, what really gets modern societies going is evolution of language and actually recently writing. And there's a certain perspective, evolutionary perspective, in which you can see the evolution of language and writing. I should stop doing that. The evolution of language and writing as continuation of DNA. So DNA is a way to code for behavior. Well, but so is cultural code. Cultural code existing as oral tradition, or cultural code maybe existing as written tradition. And sort of that's an important possibility for us to keep in mind. However, when we get to, let me read you the quote, and then I'll try to comment on it. So this is a quote. We're going to be very interested in the beginning of modern societies. This is at the very beginning of modern societies. So at the turn of in the middle of the 16th century. So a particular person being tried for attempted murder of the king. His name is Damien, not really important. So on the 2nd of March, 757, Damien, the regicide, so the person who tried to kill the king, was condemned to make the amende honorable before the main door of the church of Paris, where he was to be taken and conveyed in a cart, wearing nothing but a shirt, holding a torch of burning wax, weighing 2 pounds. Then, in the said cart, to the Place de Grève, where on a scaffold, the flesh will be torn from his breasts, arms, thighs, and calves, with red-hot pincers, his right hand burnt with sulfur, and on those places where the flesh will be torn away, poured molten lead, boiling oil, burning resin, wax, and sulfur, melted together, and then his body, drawn and quartered by 4 horses, and his limbs and body consumed by fire, reduced to ashes, and his ashes thrown to the winds. And throughout this whole procedure, this person who is being convicted here, Damien, is crying out in the same way that the damned are supposed to cry in hell. So punishment. What is this thing, punishment? Is this why do societies do that? Is it just one thing, among the various things that society does? Well, a philosopher whom we're going to talk about today, to some extent, Michel Foucault, in some sense insists that punishment is the most important, maybe the most characteristic thing that a society does. Okay, let me sort of, I wanted to begin with that quote, because I think it's an interesting quote. But at the same time, let me take several steps backward, and let me sort of redraw the picture we had on the board last time. So we can begin with, for fun, prions with a question mark. Apologies, let me just, I hope you'll forgive this small digression. So what is the difference between doing physics and doing philosophy of physics? Well, you see, if you're a physicist, you look at this formula all day long, and you stop worrying about things such as prions. You say, well, we have quantum fields, the 17 quantum fields, we have the fluctuations in the quantum fields, they are fundamental. Well, if you're doing philosophy of physics, you should stop and say, how do you know that the fields are fundamental? Are you really sure? I mean, there was a time in human intellectual history when we thought, let's say, water was fundamental, as a fundamental substance. But then we realized, well, now, actually, water is just hydrogen and oxygen. And then we thought, well, but the atoms, let's say hydrogen and oxygen, they are fundamental. But then it turns out, well, no, you can split hydrogen into protons and electrons. And then we thought, well, the protons are fundamental. But now, we can theoretically split the protons into quarks and gluons. And so, the temptation is sort of in 2020 is to say no. But the quarks and gluons really, really are fundamental. They have a theoretical predicted size of 0, and there's nothing more below that. Well, again, it's like doing philosophy of physics puts things into perspective. So how do we know? Maybe it's constituents all the way down. If you think of fractal patterns, maybe some of you have heard that. Fractals are one mathematical way of explaining irreducible complexity, where you never get to the fundamental level, as a mathematical idea. I mean, is the world like that or not? It's complicated. But this is partly why I want to write. So preons are candidates for things of which quarks are made of. So above preons, we have, let's say, quarks and leptons and other things like that. Let me just write quarks. So above quarks, we have atoms. Then we have molecules. And then we have, I don't know, cascades or sets of, or systems of chemical reactions. Let's write chemical systems. Chemical systems. On top of the and I'm specifically writing this in small letters because we don't really need to worry too much about that. And today, last time, we started talking about cultural evolution. Today, I want to continue this discussion. So, but then, very importantly, at some point, and I said, there's a story. This is not, we don't yet have complete answers, but we have some pretty decent ideas, it seems. So this is an evolving story. We think that life emerges as a chemical process. So we get something like a primitive biology. And then, in terms of biology, first of all, sort of our current thinking is that life begins as systems of chemical reactions called hypercycles in the literature. Feel free to do a presentation on it if that's your thing. So, I, just for fun, I could write hypercycles. But then, over and above hypercycles, you get something like very primitive cells, which may be equivalent to talking about organelles in a cell. A cell is made of parts, so these would be organs in a cell. Like mitochondria, for example, or the nucleus. And so above that, you have the cells, individual cells, and then, interestingly, you can get to multicellularity. So you get maybe colonies of single-celled organisms, like a simple multicellular organism in which every individual is the same. So let's say simple multicellular. I'm not even sure if that counts as multicellular if you are just clones. And then, very importantly, we get organic differentiation and we get organs. Organs within the individual. Organs within the individual. And then you get groups. And out of groups, you get societies. And finally, we get to galactic federations or something like that. International relations. And this is this story, again, this line, this is a temporal progression, but also, if you want, an ontological progression, in the sense that, so again, like from the standpoint of the history of the world, history of the universe, since the time of the Big Bang, so you have the increase in time, increase in complexity, also increase in entropy, and entropy is going to continue, and then all this complexity is going to decrease and devolve, and everything is going to devolve into a pile of goo, when the sun will blow up and black holes will evaporate through Hawking radiation, finally get to the heat death of the universe. So this is where entropy is going to take us. So time complexity, but also, importantly, like ontological priority. Ontological priority in the sense that, again, so we get from protons to presidents. And the idea is that presidents behave the way they do because protons behave the way they do. The behavior of the systems on the lower level determines the behavior of the system on the higher level. So these things are, in a certain sense, more fundamentally real than these things, up here. So this is why I talk about ontological priority. So, and in some sense, we can think of sort of, at first, you only have physics, but then chemistry emerges, then biology. So it's like disciplines emerge. Like you cannot do chemistry, 1 zeptosecond after the Big Bang because the universe is too hot for stable molecules. There isn't a single chemical reaction you can write. You don't have a single atom, a single stable atom. So physics, chemistry, then biology, cellular biology, evolutionary biology. Of course, yes, evolution is a hugely important part of all of this story. Evolution, natural selection. Evolution, natural selection, then cultural selection. So we get biology, and then somewhere over here, we get the development of simple psychology. And simple psychology seems to be mostly coded for, it's like the bare bones of psychology, seems to be mostly coded for by DNA. So this is still, psychology is an outgrowth of biology. But then Richard Dawkins calls this extended phenotype. So a certain behavior could be coded for by your genes, but a certain behavior could also be coded for by your upbringing. And again, the phrase that he uses is a memes. So you have genes, you have memes. So like a mama squirrel can teach a baby squirrel how to crack open a nut. And you can have this transmission, not genetic, but behavioral. So, and this really, so, and this is the beginning of group selection. This is the beginning of group dynamics. And we get from natural evolution to cultural evolution. So from natural evolution somewhere, let's say over here. From natural evolution, we get to cultural evolution. And then, very importantly, again, sort of around here, around here, you code for behavior. You don't really code for behavior. There's a formula that tells you how molecules and chemicals are going to behave. Up here, it is the DNA that codes for behavior. And it's a more complicated story than that, but to oversimplify. And here, at some point, you finally get the emergence of language. And again, you can see language as just a different way of coding for behavior. So the cultural evolution, the emergence of language, and finally, the emergence of social theory. Social theory. And we will, in this course, what we're going to do is I'm going to finish the story from protons to presidents today. So I'm going to tell you some bare bones account of the presidents within this naturalistic framework. Then we'll backtrack and talk about epistemology a little bit, theory of knowledge. How do scientists know all of this? And then we're going to restart this discussion. We're going to start with social theory because in some ideal world, idealized situation, the wet dream of scientists is to be able to derive sociology or social theory from this formula. But that's maybe that's impossible in principle, but at least right now it's computationally impossible. So if we want to talk about social theory, we don't derive it from physics. We derive social theory from other social theory. We derive social theory from prior social theory. So we don't need to read Newton and Einstein to understand society. We need to read Jean-Baptiste Foucault and Thomas Hobbes in order to understand society. So we're going to restart. Basically, I think Hobbes is going to be the first important thinker that whom we're going to discuss, but that's a separate story. So getting from protons to present. So when does social theory really emerge? When do you get first real social theorists? Well, obviously, yes. You can think of the ancient Greeks maybe, or Confucius, who knows? Or think about the Hindu text, the Manual on Government, Arthashastra. Maybe all of these are good candidates, but it seems that social theory really takes off with the Industrial Revolution. So IR here stands for international relations, but also equally could stand for Industrial Revolution. Industrial Revolution. And as a shadow and a mirror of the Industrial Revolution, we can also talk about the French Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution. And what is the difference? What is the difference, between the the society, in general, humanity before the Industrial Revolution and after the Industrial Revolution? And the answer seems to be, or at least the answer I'm sort of alluding to, is that we transition from traditional societies to modern societies. So from traditional societies to modern societies. And modern societies are much more fluid, much more dynamic. In fact, it seems that modern societies are essentially dynamic. There's an important element of dynamism, like change, evolution, adaptation is at the core of modern societies. And which is why, again, it seems that if you really want to talk about traditional societies, you don't really need social theory all that much. Maybe you need demography or, again, biology. You look at geographical factors. You look at epidemiological factors, like how climate works, climatological factors, when you talk about traditional societies. But when you talk about modern societies, there's a new level of complexity. There's a new emergent level that rises on top of the traditional societies. And this, first and foremost, has to do with institutions. I mean, in general, institutions. Social theory imagines society as a system of institutions. I mean, in this evolutionary terms, you could say that society is a memotype. Like, you can talk about a genotype. You can also talk about a memotype. So a collection of elements of cultural code. And the point of the cultural code would be to code for behavior, program certain types of behavior. Well, institutions within social theory, institutions refer to, so to speak, established patterns of behavior. So, and in this sense, you can imagine how people change, but society remains the same. Or if you've read one of our previous home assignments from Stephen Stearns, he talks about how the Romans have reproduced their culture in Gaul. Gaul, city Galaf. So the Romans go to a different place, a different country, different time. Not a different time, obviously, but sort of you take different people who are Gauls and you make them Romans. I mean, not perfectly, not exactly, not 100%, but sort of there's something going on there. Again, society as a system of institutions. And immediately I should say, I gave you this example 1 second ago. And this is the problem when we talk about memes and memotypes and culture, because all of these terms are very fuzzy. They are not very precise. Not as precise as this picture. And there's a reason for that, because society is so much more complex than the behavior of particles or wavicles that are described by the standard model of particle physics. And what happens is that in society, well, actually in all of science, but especially in sociology, we are forced to operate, and this is a methodological point, so I'm sort of taking a step back, but it's an important point nonetheless. We are forced to operate through ideal types. Ideal types. And the word ideal type is actually due to a wonderful German sociologist, Max Weber, but I think it applies generally. So, and sociologists or social theorists talk about these things. I mean, you are economists. That's also part of the social theory. And I'll link this to economics in a second. And in social sciences, people tend to be slightly more self-conscious, I think, of the methodology that social scientists employ for various reasons. Because methodology in the social sciences is just more problematic than in physics. The role of the observer, the role of the values of the observer, of the scientist, him or herself. But in general, we use ideal types everywhere in science. Science, in some sense, always operates with ideal types. Let's take a simple example. So I have this marker and I drop it, and it falls down. So I'm trying to explain the behavior of this marker. So maybe let's say Galileo's law S is equal to 1/2 gt squared, right? And you'd say, well, this equation describes the behavior of the marker. But the answer is, I mean, if you look at this very carefully, I mean, is it really true? Is it enough? Is this formula enough to explain the behavior of the marker? What I'm trying to say is that as an oversimplification, as an approximation, this formula works. But in reality, if you really wanted to sort of take this formula seriously and to try to track all of the influences on the behavior of the marker, you would have to take into account the resistance of air molecules, the quantum foam of virtual particle-antiparticle pairs. You would have to take into account how the black holes in distant galaxies are pulling on this marker as it falls down, right? So, but you could also, and this would make your calculation astronomically difficult, incalculably difficult. Or you could just oversimplify and say, let's imagine that this marker is a point. Let's imagine that the Earth is a point. There's no air resistance. There's no friction, no nothing, no quantum foam. There's just 2 points. They have mass. And I'm going to use this formula. And this gets you, something like 99% or maybe 99.9%. Well, it depends on what you're trying to do. Like if you're building bridges, maybe like really long bridges. Maybe you need to take into account the curvature of the Earth or something like that. But sort of in general, sort of these oversimplifications work very well in science, and this is what most people do. In fact, William Guthrie, the author of your textbook on Greek philosophy that Krista recommended last year, William Guthrie gives this example. He says, when you come with a flu to a doctor, the book was written in the 50s, so no allusion to coronavirus. So when you come with a flu to a doctor, no flu disease is identical. Every person has slightly different symptoms. Every person has slightly different immune response. But you see, if doctors tried to treat everybody as individuals, medicine would not go anywhere. So doctors oversimplify. And sometimes these oversimplifications lead to medicine not working, patients dying. But most of the time, maybe 99% of the time, or at least, let's say, 85 or 65% of the time, yeah, that's fine as an oversimplification. So this word ideal type is very important. And again, the way Weber describes it in German, he says that an ideal type is an einseitige Steigerung, a one-sided accentuation. So a social theory is like a map. So if you imagine a map of this room, again, a map is an exaggeration of some features and omission of other features and the simplification. So if you draw a map of this room, maybe you would draw tables and chairs, but you would not draw dirt on the floor. Or let's say flies came into this room, you would not put them on your map. So map abstracts. So again, an abstraction also abstracts from certain things. You imagine that they do not exist. So this is very important to keep in mind, because when you talk about physics, people have this idea, okay, yes, we have a margin of error, but we can calculate the margin of error, and we know how to calculate without the margin of error, in principle, if not in practice. You see, when you talk about social theory, this becomes much more complex. And so to go back to this example I gave, how the Romans reproduced their culture in Gaul. Is it true? Well, in any literal sense of the word, no, of course it is not true. It's not true, but it is useful as an ideal type. And ideal types can be more robust or less robust. And the idea Weber had, and of course, in some sense it's a straightforward idea, is that the real type, the real world, is the combination of an infinite number of ideal types, or infinite, or at least very large number of ideal types. The same way that, again, you can oversimplify the following of this marker, but the real type would be all the forces that operate on this marker. The strong force, weak force, the Higgs field, etc. So all everything, and all the stars and planets within the past light cone of this marker you'd have to take into account. But you can also abstract. But again, the combination of the ideal types would give you a real type. And it seems that in social theory, sort of, it's like our ideal types tend to be less robust. So it seems that it is essential to always combine perspectives, which is why if you take serious social theory courses in University of London, they always invite you to look at things from different perspectives, because every perspective is going to have limitations. And sort of keeping perspectives in mind, like shifting your eyes a little bit, like having these gestalt switches in your head, is what really allows you to draw a rich and much more truthful picture of the world. Although, unfortunately, again, for reasons of mathematical reasons of complexity, we don't get simple, straightforward laws in society the same way we get in physics. Although physics laws can also be complicated. Think of the three-body problem, if you've heard about that. Anyway, let me not digress. Although that's an interesting topic. Ask me in the seminar, what's the three-body problem? So, I promised to talk about economics. Economists use this all the time. There's this wonderful Latin phrase, ceteris paribus, or ceteris paribus, how we want to pronounce that. It's sort of other things being equal. So there's a tendency, other things being equal. But in society, other things are never equal. Sort of there's all sorts of effects stacking one on top of the other, but you can isolate, let's say, the effect of the price or the effect of the demand, something like that, right? And sort of through a combination of an infinite number of ideas, or let's say perfect competition. Perfect competition is an idealized model. It's somewhat maybe more or less robust, and you see the real world as a combination of a large array of these types. So I want to get to society, and I want to explain why I meant to talk about Michel Foucault today. But I think that within society, there are certain maybe privileged ideal types that we need to talk about. And I want to talk about, I think I mentioned in the past several times already, these ideas of conflict and consensus. Conflict and consensus. I'm not inventing this. I'm actually taking this from a University of London Introduction to Sociology study guide. So this is in some sense the way the University of London introduces students to the study of society. And any kind, different names I could write on the board. But the two names that come to mind whenever I think about this would be Heraclitus and Aristotle. So Heraclitus would be the champion of conflict, and Aristotle, in some sense, the champion of consensus. And so, not to beat around the bush, let me give you the conclusions up front. So I'm going to say that these are two ideal types, and probably the productive way, although who knows, but probably the productive way of looking at society is to see society as a combination of these, to see society as a combination of these two ideal types. I think both are true to some extent. Society is to some extent conflictual, but is also the seat of conflict. Okay, I mentioned this in the past, but let me reiterate. So Heraclitus, gotta love Heraclitus, one of the most illustrious of the Greek philosophers, writing before Socrates. Heraclitus talks about this wonderful phrase from polemos pater panton, war is the father and the king of all. Also, in a different place, the idea being that everything is in constant flux and everything is in constant struggle. And in fact, in a deep sense, everything is at war with itself. And again, another Greek phrase from Heraclitus, palintropos harmonia, that sort of things, palintropos harmonia means something like harmony of opposing tensions. Although harmony is probably not the best word, it is like a harmony in the sense of truce or a stalemate or a deadlock between opposing tensions. I might have talked about this, I'm not sure. Maybe I talked about this in the last class. Huh? Yeah, very good. So how in the atom, right? Well, let's imagine a simplified example. So the protons in the nucleus are the electromagnetic force is trying to push them apart, but the strong force is trying to keep them together, right? And sort of the atom continues stable into the future because the two forces are in a stalemate. Like in this tug of war, they are drawn to a stalemate, they're fighting each other to a standstill. And this standstill is what produces the illusion of harmony, order, or even continuity in the future, right? And sort of, again, I keep talking about this process ontology, that on a deep fundamental level, nouns do not exist. The only thing that is real are verbs. And you can talk about nouns only because verbs, certain verbs, prop up the nouns every moment, from moment to moment, momentarily into the future. This is Heraclitean picture, and especially if you look at ancient sophists, there's a strange tendency to sort of disregard ancient sophists. It's very strange because critical theory in general and sort of social criticism is a very important tradition. I mean, Thrasymachus, when people talk about how Thrasymachus is this shrewd, politician in the bad sense of the word, but honestly, what is Thrasymachus saying? He says, in every society there is a ruling elite. And this ruling elite imposes their will on everybody else. And so there is no such thing as justice. There's no such thing as goodness. The words, such as justice, they always mask somebody's interest. In fact, he says, we know whose interest they mask. They mask the interest of the group that is in power. And so whenever people do presentations on universal human values, or maybe what is the right thing to do. Do you really know what is the right thing to do? Or have we been indoctrinated by the ruling group to believe that we know what is the right thing to do? I mean, I don't want to get into this, but this is I think this is a powerful idea that has to be kept in mind. It's a very infuriating idea. It's a very disconcerting idea. This idea that there is no truth, there is only persuasion. There is no justice, there's only power play. Mm-hmm. So it's a very disconcerting idea, and I think it has to be sort of taken seriously, even though, maybe at the end of the day, if you tried to live consistently this way like that, you wouldn't go very far. Because if you really believe that the world is at war with itself, you get into this very uncomfortable picture. You walk around the room and you see the walls staring at you, and sort of, social theory. This class is an instance of social interaction. How do we apply conflict to this room? Is this really a situation of conflict where I, in a position of power, am sort of, or I don't want to say just in a position of power, but there's a power structure in our society, and university is part of that. And teachers in the university are part of that repressive apparatus. That, we are forcing you students to sit here quietly, listen, take notes, and we're going to have exams, and we're going to punish you for with bad grades if you don't. Sort of this is the part of this, and the conflictual view of this classroom, and the idea being that ultimately, my job is not to teach you the truth, but my job is maybe to make you useful to the ruling class. Or my job is maybe to indoctrinate you to make you less dangerous. Now, this is a very disconcerting point of view for a very simple reason. Because if you take it to heart and if you start looking at the world this way, you stop coming to class. This is kind of a dangerous possibility inherent in thinking about this. See, I'm always saying, philosophy is a dangerous enterprise. And of course, you could stop coming to class, or maybe you could get some other more interesting ideas. Who knows, right? So, am I trying to undermine the social order? And sort of, in some sense, I want you to be aware of this perspective, because everything I'm going to say now in defense of the consensus view, these guys are going to say, Alex, you're telling a story. You're telling a story to try to justify your position, to try to mask the apparatus of power which actually operates from moment to moment. But the consensual side of the story is different, and again, I don't necessarily expect you to believe me after I just propped up Heraclitus, but the consensual side of the story, and I would say, Aristotle comes to mind, but maybe Hegel is even a more important thinker within this tradition. You can think of Hegel as a neo-Aristotelian. We'll talk about Hegel, partly precisely for this reason, because he explains consensus philosophy so well. So Aristotle is going to say, look, man is by nature a political animal. Again, you have this word, zoon politikon. A human being cannot survive a single day without the help of society. I mean, human babies are born helpless. Some fish are not born helpless, or some mammals, and they can just run off and never even look at their parents. But this is not how human babies are born. Actually, there's a deep and interesting evolutionary reason that babies have to be born helpless, because this allows certain malleability and adaptability of our brain. Like, we could not really think, we could not really be rational if we were born ready for life. Because to be born ready for life means to be born pre-programmed, right? And that's important, that human beings are born helpless, not pre-programmed. And that we sort of, biologically, there's a possibility for culture to fix some of the programming, and for your own behavior, to influence your program, broadly speaking, and not just be like a stimulus reaction automaton, right? Anyway, so again, go back to Aristotle. So we are born helpless, and only with the help of society can we persist. And it's like, on the one hand, you can go out into the street and think, oh, this is all coercion. These are okay. So since I have Hegel on this side of the board, let me add Marx on this side of the board, or actually Marx or Nietzsche. In different ways with the question marks. And it depends on how you interpret them. But you could sort of go out into the street and you could say, oh, all of these people, they're being exploited. They're being taken advantage of. And there's a repressive apparatus of the state. There's a police with rubber bullets and tear gas ready, at a moment's notice. Interesting examples recently in the news. Let's not comment on that, right? But we know that it's arm's reach between us and the tear gas and rubber bullets, as a matter of fact, right? And sort of the media is indoctrinating individuals, brainwashing them, and so is religion, so is the church, so is textbooks, so is universities. Sort of ideological state apparatus, repressive state apparatus. This is one side of the board. But the other side of the board, sort of the Aristotelian side of the board, is like, look, you were able to get here in one piece. Nobody attacked you in the street. Nobody, took out their Kalashnikov. Nobody punched you in the face. Look, we're all sitting here, well behaved. Nobody's undressing. I'm not taking my clothes off, rolling on the floor and blowing bubbles out of my face, or something like that, right? So there's a picture of consensus, and a couple of examples that come to mind when I talk about Aristotle in this respect. I've been reading Aristotle. This happened a couple of years ago, and I was secluded in my parents' country house, completely alone for a couple of weeks, just reading Aristotle. And Aristotle says how philosophy is the most divine activity, among other things, because philosophy is the most self-sufficient activity. Like, you don't need anything else in order to do philosophy. And I'm sitting there, like, completely alone, haven't talked to another human being for maybe a week or so. And I'm thinking, yeah, Aristotle is completely right. And then, in a Marxist fashion, it dawns on me, how wrong I am. Because for me, in order to be able to do philosophy alone, how much has to happen? Look, I am sitting there alone, yes, but I am reading Aristotle. Somebody has printed the book. Incidentally, I was also listening to a lecture. Somebody, another lecturer, has recorded the lecture. This lecturer had teachers who helped him understand Aristotle. I'm listening to this on my device. This device was made by somebody. It was shipped by somebody. This device uses electricity. Somebody's making electricity, right? So in this sense, sort of the idea is that society, there's repression. Society represses us. Society restricts us. So repression and restriction. But society also enables us. And you cannot have one without the other. And again, in a deep sense, what I'm trying to say is that these are like bifocals. These are like a pair of glasses. And you have the left lens and the right lens. And you need to put both on. And then you see social reality by combining the two perspectives. And something I wanted to mention vis-a-vis Aristotle and the consensual perspective. Well, anyway, hopefully it'll get to me. You know, all sorts of things, you know, could be said in this respect. Freud, definitely. I wanted to talk about Freud. So we have Freud, we have Nietzsche, we have Heidegger, and all of these philosophers are pessimistic philosophers. They look at human beings as, and I have this phrase, which is more or less my own compilation of thoughts of, you know, philosophers like Nietzsche, Freud, and others, that human beings are anxious, mostly unconscious, products of larger forces, of biological and cultural evolution, manufactured by these forces, not to be happy. Are we really happy, even though this is a consensual picture? Not to be happy, but to fulfill a certain function in the perpetuation of the logic of the systems of biological and cultural evolution, right? And we want things that we do not really need, and the things that we really need we cannot even in principle get. And so here's a hugely important idea, which is kind of maybe tries to straddle this divide between conflict and consensus. This idea of liberation. What is liberation, and what does liberation look like? Is this word even meaningful? Liberation, let me write this. And again, if you think of Freud, the question is not of getting rid of repressions. If you just take a child and just like no repression, no violence whatsoever, Freudian idea is that you will not get a healthy child. You will not get a sort of healthy, productive, happy individual. No, you will get sort of a neurotic, screaming monkey, sort of maybe like a heroin addict or something like that. But certainly not what we consider to be happy, you know, happiness or health. So again, in some sense, the idea, I mean, Enlightenment was very optimistic. We'll talk about Enlightenment in a later class. So beginning with people like, again, Hobbes and maybe Locke and Rousseau, or people like Immanuel Kant, there was this idea that human beings are essentially rational. And so it is possible to create a rational society in which the laws are rational, individuals are rational, and we can sort of, through understanding society, make laws which will be in everybody's interest. And we can engineer social harmony in which you will be perfectly free and also perfectly obedient to the laws, because you will choose to obey the laws freely, because the laws will be in your interest. Right? So this is the picture of the Enlightenment. And people like, again, Freud and Nietzsche and Heidegger and Foucault, we're going to talk about in a second, or Marx even, they're suspicious of this. Because they say the harmony between the interests of the individual and of society could exist, or you know, seems to exist, not because somehow it just so magically happens that the interests of the individual and the society coincide. But no, the harmony exists because societies produce the kinds of individuals through upbringing, but also maybe through selection. Because, you know, we don't allow psychopaths to reproduce by and large. Anyway, or maybe not psych, but extreme sociopaths, right? Societies produces the kinds of individuals that it needs. So this is, again, palinthropos harmonia. So there's an attunement between the interests of the individual and of society, because society forces individuals into a certain mold, into a certain frame, into a certain shape. Again, this question Ivan has asked in the previous seminar: who is stronger, society or the individual? It seems society. the answer is society. But again, and this is a very important point I'm sort of driving at, is that for philosophers after, again, Nietzsche, Freud, and Foucault, we don't talk about liberation because it seems that there's nothing to liberate. Again, there's no such thing as human individuality. Like within your head, there's a million different souls. There's different modules, different genes, different memes fighting against each other within your head. There's no such thing as you. You are a product of this careful balance. So there is no, the word liberation cannot mean just absence of constraint. This is not real liberation. Liberation after Nietzsche and Freud can only mean another form of determination, or maybe more correct, more appropriate form of determination. How Herbert Marcuse, you might have heard this name, talks about the necessary level of repression. He also talks about the unnecessary, excessive repressions, and we should get rid of them, Marcuse thinks. But there's also a necessary level of repression, necessary level of sublimation, which is necessary for society to function. And sort of without that, society just falls apart, collapses in on itself. This is a very Hegelian thought that sort of it is not absence of constraint, but the right kind of determination that makes you free. That to be free is to be determined by right reason, if you want, by the correct reason, correct thinking. It's kind of I don't know. So I don't mean we could talk about this like for a million hours, but sort of if you think about this again, like vision of health and success, what it's like to be a good human being. Like you wake up in the morning, you don't get out of bed, you take a bowl of ice cream, stuff it in your face, maybe shoot yourself up with heroin, sort of just having fun time. Is this really what human happiness looks like? I mean, a lot of people are tempted to think that that's good, but if you actually try it, I imagine you ISIF students, you can probably afford that. And would you actually enjoy that kind of life? Hegel says, no, you wake up, you follow a certain healthy regimen of maybe exercise, healthy regimen of sort of eating habits, and then you're trying to do something meaningful with your life. Maybe you're trying to, write a book or play or become a scientist or discover something. But there are again, the Greek word arete, you're trying to achieve human excellence. You are trying to develop your rich and varied abilities. This is what Hegel says, and Marx, because again, Marx, when he talks about capitalism, he's squarely on this side of the board. But of course, you can imagine Marx on this side of the board when Marx is trying to imagine or describe this potential future communism. Although, again, you see, it's a big problem, and sort of we'll talk about Marx. We're going to have a class on Marx, but let's start thinking about this right now. I think it's a very big and important problem, because communism for Marx is very much on board with the evolutionary picture. I mean, social economic formations fight against one another. They compete against one another, and the most efficient one comes on top. So communism, first and foremost for Marx, is not a more humane society. It is a more efficient society. It is a well-ordered society. Are you going to have repressions in communism? Are you going to have upbringing? Are you going to have police in communism? Will you have surveillance in communism? Do you need surveillance cams in communism? Complicated questions. I don't necessarily mean to answer them right now, but sort of to begin thinking about them. Sort of to get them into your head. But again, especially, this is a very important idea that liberation is just another form of determination, or can only be another form of determination. And so, well, again, so probably a million things I could have said, but let me sort of slowly segue into Michel Foucault. And I'm not sure if we have time. Maybe we'll get an occasion to get acquainted with Michel Foucault in a slightly more systematic fashion. But for our purposes, so again, Michel Foucault died, the second half of the 20th century. I think he died in 1984, I think, or maybe 1987. So he's a very recent thinker. Unfortunately, died very young from AIDS. Tragic story. He could have been alive today, although very old. And Michel Foucault liked to really, really, really oversimplify, just sort of we get a certain basic idea. Foucault is kind of a combination of Nietzsche and Marx. It's not exactly true, but again, as a starting point, it gets us somewhere. So Michel Foucault. And Foucault's basic idea, if I may try to explain it, is that there is an important relation between power and knowledge. And there are different ways to discuss and different ways to describe this. So power, knowledge. Actually, let me draw it differently. So So knowledge is power, and power leads to knowledge. And there are ways to explain this picture, but it's sort of we can come to this idea slightly from a side. The idea being the following: that yeah, you have your biology, but your biology does not determine very much about your behavior. That really the most important thing that makes you is culture. It's like it's not men who make history, but history makes men. And when we talk about history, we're talking about history of culture. And you could say, well, no, Alex, it's not history of culture, it's guns. Well, guns are also part of culture. Know-how, how to make steel, how to make guns out of steel, all that kind of thing. I'm rushing ahead, but let me just write on the board. Economics is very important, as you know, for Marx, and economics, or economy in general, is going to be very important for Foucault as well. And we have to also see economic relations as relations of power. So economics is about power. Economics is about power. We'll talk about this in a second. So keeping this in mind, and again, sort of, Foucault is also deep and careful reader of Heidegger. And again, this idea that we are the way we are because of the culture that we were born in. That, well, I drew power knowledge. Maybe I should draw knowledge on the top. And when we say knowledge, in this sense, I don't really mean knowledge like what is truth. I mean knowledge more in a sense of ideology. So let me, again, maybe not knowledge, but ideology. And it's interesting because both Marx and Nietzsche and Heidegger are very, let's throw Heidegger into the mix, for them, the idea of the phrase, the concept of ideology is crucially important. This idea that there's a certain system of beliefs, which may or may not be true, who knows? A system of beliefs that people get socialized into, people get indoctrinated into, and this is what allows society to persist into the future. Culture, broadly speaking, or if you want to use more naturalistic metaphors, you can talk about cultural code. So the standard way to talk about Foucault is the following. There are three historical epochs that Foucault is going to pay attention to. So the first one is going to be traditional societies. Traditional societies. And this is associated with what Foucault calls sovereign power. Sovereign power. Then on the second stage, we have early modern societies. Early modern societies. And they are associated with what Foucault calls disciplinary power. And today we're in the third stage, and this would be, well, let's say, right, contemporary societies. And this is what Foucault calls biopower. Now, let me start somewhere from afar. So there's another philosopher, but most importantly, social theorist, Emile Durkheim. Emile Durkheim. I don't think that Foucault actually refers to Durkheim, but Durkheim is kind of, I always find it useful to refer to Durkheim whenever I explain these things. So let's go back a couple steps and start with with an evolutionary story, broadly speaking. So Durkheim says that early human societies are, simple. They resemble primitive animal groups. They also resemble primitive organisms. And Durkheim says that what holds, and again, some very important notion. Foucault doesn't really use it, but Durkheim uses it. The word is solidarity. Solidarity, squarely on the consensus side. Although you would say, on the conflict side, you would say that solidarity does not emerge. Solidarity is imposed, I suppose, right? So solidarity, the idea of solidarity, which is necessary for society to function. It's kind of interesting. People talk about competition, but of course, even in market forces, competition is only possible against the background of basic cooperation. It is because we all recognize the rules of the free market that competition can operate. That sort of, in a deep sense of the term, competition is just economic competition in the market. Market economic competition is just another form of cooperation. Anyway, so in traditional societies, solidarity is what, again, to use Durkheim's phrase, it is a mechanical solidarity, mechanical. And what we have are, he calls this segmentary differentiation. That's not important. I'm not going to write this on the board. But the idea of segmentary differentiation is that, again, you imagine a colony of simple single-celled organisms. They have segments, and these segments are identical. So basically, so you have individual households, and individual households are very much like one another. They look alike, and they also, each individual household produces everything that it needs. And so the basis of this mechanical solidarity is basically likeness. We are like one another. We look the same, we dress the same, we use the same language, we believe in the same gods. It's very important, right? Again, religion, interesting, right? So regardless of whether you believe in God or not, it doesn't really matter very much. On the conflict picture, religion is a force of domination, a force of indoctrination. On the consensus side, again, regardless of whether you believe in God or not, religion is what stabilizes social bond. So it's like on the conflictual side, if you think of Gnostics, they would say that most religions are false because they believe in idolatrous or evil gods, or maybe not even gods, but demons. This would be sort of a way to believe in God in the conflictual side. The way to not believe in God on the consensual side is to say, yes, gods don't exist, but gods are useful metaphors. And in fact, the religious story, even though not true literally, is true metaphorically, in the sense that if all people, let's say, are good Christians, we don't really go to heaven after we die because we're all just a bunch of molecules, but we stabilize the social bond, and we can approximate the kingdom of heaven on earth simply because people behave. And yeah, most people are irrational, unfortunately, so you cannot explain this to them through rational means, but through this use of religious language and religious myth and metaphor, you can persuade them, even though most people will not be able to understand, but at least they will be persuaded into doing the right things, right? So, of course, let's say on this picture, nothing wrong about abortion, but it's good to cultivate superstitiously in the mind of a person in the street that human life is sacred. Because if they don't think that, maybe they'll get some crazy ideas. So the elite is free to not believe in gods, but the sheeple in the street should believe. It has an important function. Anyway, so this is traditional societies. Now, I'm going to talk about modern societies, and immediately you will see that it's an ideal type. I'm saying that modern societies emerged during the Industrial Revolution. So we talk about this transition in terms of the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution. And you're going to immediately say, well, but Alex, don't the things I'm going to write here, don't they exist in societies before? And the answer is probably yes, which is why this isn't, again, a map, an oversimplification, einseitige Steigerung, right, an ideal type. It's not literally true, but you can see some. But again, the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution is really when this whole new dynamic takes hold. So, and here, the idea is that your solidarity is not mechanical, but it is organic. Organic in the sense that you have organs that interact with each other. And so you don't have this likeness. No. Now you have functional. So this here you had segmentary differentiation, just different segments of the same thing. Now you have functional differentiation. And here, the basis of solidarity was likeness. Here now, the basis of solidarity is interdependence. I am explaining to you in 5 minutes the whole history of humanity. I hope you appreciate that. Maybe some of you will find that this is more useful than the 10 years of history you took at school. Who knows? Maybe not. Maybe I'm just being megalomaniacal. Anyway, so organic differentiation. And the base of organic differentiation is, again, interdependence. Interdependence. That sort of, let's say you have the blacksmith who cannot survive without the soldier who protects him, who cannot survive without the farmer who grows food, and sort of this is how all this stuff gets going. And you could ask, well, but couldn't we just continue in this old mechanical solidarity? Again, the idea is very clear for somebody like Durkheim, or for somebody like Marx, or for somebody like Foucault. The transition happens for a very simple reason, because this is so much more efficient. And if you do not believe in cultural evolution, if you do not believe in sort of memes fighting against one another, think about this. Think about the competition between industrialized countries and pre-industrial countries. Think about the industrial Britain conquering pre-industrial India. This is competition. This is driving certain, not necessarily whole cultures, but driving certain mnemotypes, certain ways of behavior to extinction. So let's say in India, they used to be rural peasants, but now they have to become factory workers. They have to man the factories, stand and work. Why? Because it's a huge conspiracy, lizard people, controlling human history behind the scenes. No, says somebody like Marx or like Durkheim. No, it is a natural process. It is akin to natural selection. It's adapt or die, evolve, industrialize or die. It's like somebody, let's say, at the eve of the First World War, the adoption of smokeless powder smokeless gunpowder, бездымный порох. So again, it's a question of military necessity. We either adopt this in the next couple of years, or there's not going to be a France anymore, right? Or there's not going to be an Austria anymore, or a Russia anymore. Because we're simply going to be driven to extinction. Again, a word that can be used to describe biological evolution, but also now cultural evolution. And so here, let's go back to this idea of punishment. What holds societies together? And partly you could say, and this is an important idea, an important thought. So when we look at Freud, when we look at contemporary psychologists like Robert Wright or Daniel Kahneman, it seems fairly uncontroversial to say that human beings, in our DNA, we are pre-programmed to respond to stimuli. We are social and political creatures by nature in terms of our biology. It's like if I'm standing here laughing and smiling, the emotion is contagious. There's a biochemical, electrochemical process that reads you, sort of, I don't want to say forces, but leads your mind to read off the emotion on my face and to secrete certain hormones in your head. There's a certain interface. We are social creatures. Again, biologically, we are social creatures, and we are driven, among other things, to conformity. We're driven to conform to the norms, follow rules. It feels nice to follow the generalized social norms. Most normal, anatomically and psychologically normal people derive pleasure from that over and above any kind of benefit you can get from that. Whereas, again, it's like it seems, again, from the standpoint of contemporary psychology, that this is hardwired in our genes. And in fact, some people are not wired that way. And we diagnose them with disorders like psychopathy or sociopathy. People who feel no pain of conscience when they violate a norm or a rule, right? And so, in a deep sense, we have this. Again, so big and important question of coercion and cooperation. Coercion versus cooperation. And what I'm trying to say is that on this mechanistic picture, mechanistic through and through, there is no interesting difference between coercion and cooperation. I mean, there's, let's say, more or less harmonized systems, and you can see more or less conflict. But in general, at the end of the day, if you see cooperation because cooperation is enforced by certain mechanisms. And so here, we talk about punishment in some deep sense of the word, punishment being the most important thing that society does. Well, I suppose, in addition to punishment, there's also like human groups that do not, especially in traditional times, who do not have high degrees of solidarity. They're simply conquered. They're destroyed. Again, genocide is. We can look at bones of ancient humans. Genocide is very common. You have these small tribes constantly at war with one another. Sort of, if your group doesn't have enough solidarity, you die. And think about this for 5 seconds. Most languages, most cultures, most religions that existed on planet Earth are extinct. They're not here anymore. And sort of, you and me, we are products of the very few survivors who have stood the test of time and evolved up to this present day. So yeah. So here, what was I gonna say? Second time in the lecture, I'm losing my thought. Punishment, of course, punishment. But in addition to this external punishment, in the sense of being conquered, there's also very important internal punishment. So, again, if you think about this in terms of your own body, in your own body, the cells behave, well, partly because of this, again, evolutionary history, and your ancestors in which cells within your body did not cooperate, they went extinct, they died, they're not here anymore. They don't have any children. This is akin to war. So actually, war is somewhere over here in all of this. So let me write this. War or other forms of competition. Because losing economic competition can also lead to disastrous results. At least from the standpoint of the sort of cultural code, how sort of well, I mean, think of Russia in the 90s. The socialist system falls down, and you import cultural code from the West, right? You start doing things differently. So again, in terms of the evolutionary picture, this is what actually counts, because the unit of selection in cultural evolution is, means cultural code. People can remain the same, but the culture will be forced to adapt. Anyway, so but again, very important. Punishment. Here, punishment is gruesome. It's spectacular, and it's violent. Usually, it's death, and the punishment is. The code, right? The code is penal, or justice is penal. You punish, you destroy, you maim. And again, go look back to this quote I gave you from the beginning of the lecture. So this poor person is hacked to pieces. His remains burnt, the ashes scattered to the wind, and throughout the whole ordeal, the person cries as the damned are supposed to cry in hell. And so this punishment is first of all important because it gets rid of the dangerous element. But also, and this is what increasingly we're going to see on this consensus side of the board, increasingly what we see is that everything is actually functional. Everything that society does. There's healthy level of drug use in society. There's healthy level of prostitution. There's healthy level of discontent. There's also healthy level of crime. Healthy level of crime. You need some people to transgress the norms from time to time so that when the person is publicly executed, everybody can look at them and everybody can see this is what we're not supposed to do. Right? So again, crime on Durkheimian picture, crime is functional. Crime plays an important function. And if all crime stopped, this would actually be bad for society because this would not reinforce the social norms as much. But here, in the mechanistic, organic solidarity picture, sort of after the French Revolution, the characteristic punishment is not penal, it is restitutive. Restitutive justice or restitutive punishment is not supposed to destroy the individual, hack them into a bloody pulp, but justice is supposed to repair the social bond. And immediately I should say that, again, these are ideal types because of course you had interdependence in ancient Greece, let's say in ancient Athens. And of course you had some form of organic solidarity in ancient Rome. But the idea is that this really takes hold only after the Industrial Revolution. And before that, the vast majority of people lead deeply, deeply traditional lives. Like for the vast majority of people before the Industrial Revolution, the answer, what you're going to do in life, is going to be the same thing your father did. And for the vast majority of people, this would be farming. You'd be a peasant. For the vast majority of people on planet Earth. So these societies are deeply, deeply static. And but let me also notice, so when we talk about this, we have the basis of mechanical solidarity. And on top of this mechanical solidarity, we build organic solidarity. On top, which is to say that in this room, or I mean in this country, let's say Russia, right? Durkheim would say that there's interdependence and cooperation between the groups, but also behind that, on a more basic level, we also have our likenesses. We maybe speak the same language. We have the same basic values. Maybe we mostly believe in the same gods, or at least we have same tolerant attitudes to predominant religions, or something like that, right? And also, very importantly, like the same way how in the mechanical solidarity there is, a punishment that's supposed to hack, destroy, and maim. We also have these kinds of punishments. There are people in our society whom it is all right to hate with all your heart. Maybe the pedophiles or the Nazis, right? It's okay to have this collective effervescent, spectacle. How we unite in the immense hatred in the dehumanizing hatred against these people, whom it's fine to do whatever you want to them. Think of me. I mean, whom is it politically correct to brutally kill in video games or on cinema, right? So we still have these kinds of ideas at the basis of our society. But sort of this basis is much less important for industrialized societies. Now, again, organic solidarity based on interdependence is becoming much more important. Now, let me continue with this phrase, coercion, cooperation. When we say that there are different skills, we see skills, I mean functional differentiation, right? Different functions. Functions are not created equal. One function is to do stupid, tiresome, menial job. Another function is to rule a state. Functions are not created equal. There's a hierarchy of functions. And the idea, or you could say the ideology behind this picture, and in some sense it goes back to Plato's Republic. The ideology behind this picture is that there are two triangles. There's the triangle of talent, and there's the triangle of positions in society. And the idea is that in a properly functioning system, you have a correspondence of one to another. And this is, of course, known as meritocracy, right? Rule of merit. Again, I mentioned Plato's Republic a second ago. That's the whole idea of Plato's Republic. Sort of the people will occupy the positions to which they are best suited so that they can contribute as much as possible to the whole. But somebody like Marx, so this is the consensual side of the story. But somebody like Marx or somebody like Foucault is going to say, no. This is not a consensual picture. In fact, what happens is that there are positions in society, and then there will be coercive mechanisms that will force, not necessarily even in this direction, but sort of in some direction, right? Coercive mechanisms that will force individuals to occupy particular slots in the division of labor. It's like Marx says that in communism, we're going to have free division of labor, and differently abled individuals will perform different tasks. Or it's like in Plato's Republic, differently abled individuals, will be able to develop their rich and varied abilities in conjunction with others. But Marx says, under capitalism, it's the other thing. Differently abled individuals with different talents, different abilities, different interests, all walk into the same factory and perform the same stupid menial job. Nobody, says Marx, is born a shoemaker or a driver or a delivery man. It is the demands of the economy that force people into these positions of power. And actually, I'm jumping slightly all around the place, but let me finish this thought. So Foucault's probably most important work, not necessarily his most interesting, but probably most well-known work, it's called Surveiller et punir, Discipline and Punish. Discipline and Punish. It's about the birth of modern disciplinary apparatus. And we'll talk about this in a second. And basically, the way Foucault writes this, he writes this as a companion volume to Marx's Das Kapital. Marx will explain how capitalism gets going in terms of this initial accumulation of capital. But Foucault is going to say, in addition to the initial accumulation of capital, you also need the initial accumulation of labor. You need to take, because again, this transition took place historically. You had these traditional peasants living in the land who were used to sort of a fairly leisurely way of doing their work somewhere in the fields, and there were far more peasants than you needed actually on the land. One of the first things that rich landowners discovered in the Industrial Revolution is that economies of scale, you do not need so many peasants. So they expelled huge numbers of peasants from the land, and there's a huge mass of declassed workers, not even workers, but just rabble. Just peasants who were expelled from the land, who have nothing to do, who flock to the cities, and who become dangerous elements, who commit crimes, who spread disease, who are unproductive. And in fact, historians tell me that in Napoleonic times, Britain deployed more troops at home to fight against its own peasants than they deployed against Napoleon. And this is a kind of secret side of the story. Again, it's ideology covers all this up behind this consensual facade. But Marx and Foucault is going to alert our attention to the fact that, again, behind the modern capitalism, you see the system of coercion. And again, I mentioned this. Economic power is first and foremost political power. These peasants are forced to work for a given, let's say, factory owner, on the pain of starvation on the one hand, but also on the pain of the troops with bayonets and rifles. So in a deep sense, the one important insight that we're going to get from Marx when we get to Marx in a couple of classes is that capitalism is a continuation of feudalism by other means, that most workers are formally free, that they're formally free to choose who's going to exploit them, but actually, at the end of the day, the vast majority of workers are not essentially different from serfs, from крепостные крестьяне, or slaves, if you want, for that matter. They're forced to work by economic and political necessity. And so I only have, I think, 7 minutes, right? Which is not much. Yeah, 7 minutes, is that right? So I'm not sure if I'll be able to explain this all in complete detail. But again, Foucault is going to say that this punishment was visible, spectacular, but also intermittent and not very efficient. But now, it's not that we punish less. It's not that contemporary society punishes less, but we punish better. And he talks about this whole system of institutions of, and actually, sort of for both disciplinary power and biopower. We're talking about instruments of observation and examination. Observation and examination. Sort of, it's an idea that goes back to Jeremy Bentham, It's called Panopticon. You might have heard of Jeremy Bentham. Bentham was writing approximately at this time of the transition, where you had all these peasants. And he said he imagined this architectural design, which is actually so much more than an architectural design. How you imagine a prison where in the middle you have a tower, and through a system of light and shadow, today we would say a one-way mirror, and you have prison cells around the tower, right? Individual prison cells, right? And the idea is that through a system of light and shadow, one-way mirror, a guard is hidden inside the tower. And so a guard can observe all the cells, and the cells are all open. The prisoners cannot see each other, but they can all see the darkness in the middle, right? The darkness in the middle of the tower. So the idea is that there's this normalizing gaze. The individual prisoners, the individual inmates, they internalize this constant fear of being observed, and so they begin to discipline themselves. Foucault has this very ominous phrase, but again, a very Freudian phrase. He talks about how the soul is the prison of the body. The soul is the prison of the body. And many of you will experience this. In a couple of weeks, you're going to have your exams begin, you're going to have your session, and your body will groan and will ache, and you will want to sleep or something. But your soul, the prison of your body, will force you to work, will force you to prepare for the exams. And this is basically, Foucault's idea that sort of these disciplinary mechanisms, these mechanisms of normalization and discipline, they begin in isolated institutions. So again, on the left side, I'm going to talk about disciplinary power. On the right side, I'm going to talk about biopower. So we begin with isolated institutions like prisons. Let's say prisons. But now we apply these to all of society. So it used to be that the prisoners were disciplined. Now you're disciplined. There's a camera in this room right now, staring at you, right? And at me as well, right? It used to be applied to dangerous elements, but now it's applied to everybody. And the point is not to reduce danger, but to increase efficiency. Again, so in the past, people were observed, don't commit crimes, but now you are all observed, you are rated, you have a rating, and each and every one of you is supposed to feel bad that they are not at the top of the rating. And you can quantify, how you can improve your performance, right? And so also sort of Foucault talks about how, well, it used to be applied to individuals, but now it's an interesting word that he uses, that he invents actually, governmentality, a combination of two words, government and mentality. How this is applied in terms of population and the population as a whole. So in some sense, again, to oversimplify, you can see population is like a resource in a strategy game or something like that, right? Why does the government take care of you in terms of, let's say, vaccination? Oh, that's wonderful. All sorts of examples come out of the coronavirus outbreak. But why does the government take care of you? Out of the kindness of the heart? No, because the government wants you to be productive, wants you to be productive taxpayers, wants you not to commit crime. Again, and this is very much Foucault. So I should probably add Foucault very much on the right side. Foucault is very much here instead of the conflict. That the only reason why there's a semblance of harmony in society is because we were coerced since childhood through a system of micro penalties and micro rewards. And he talks about how society is permeated, and everything you do, there's micro penalties for lateness, micro penalties for lack of cleanliness, micro penalties for lack of zeal, for not working as hard as you could. And Foucault says, who disciplines us? Is this a conspiracy theory? No, says Foucault. Everybody disciplines everybody else. In some sense, it's not like, it's a deeper thought, but let me just get this out. It's not like I am speaking a language. No, it is language speaking through me. I have been it's not history makes men, but not man make history, but history makes men. Sort of, I am standing here. By the way, also observed, right? And sort of my performance, is this just something I do out of the kindness of my heart, simply because I am fulfilled? Or is it because I am observed and I'm trying to give a lecture which is in accordance with certain standards? How much do I actually choose at the end of the day of this lecture, of what to give? And sort of Foucault's basic idea is, again, sort of that sort of if you think about this observation, like all of society is like this, and everybody is observed, everybody is a prisoner. And you can ask, but what about the guards? Well, the guard is observed by, let's say, a general, and the general is observed by a minister, and the minister is observed by the president, and the president is also observed by everybody. And if you think about, even if you want to become a dictator, how many hoops you have to jump through, right? Not just anybody can become a dictator. Dictators have power base, and like even in some mafia boss, right? The individuals who are gonna have allegiance to you have to see that you are the right kind of person. And I mean, very importantly, all of this is deeply, deeply structural. This is not because some people are evil or anything like that, but because there's a certain structure, social structure, culture, to oversimplify, that produces us the way we are. And the easiest way to exemplify this is to think of political power. And there's a very important pessimistic and conservative element in Foucault. Basically, it doesn't really matter who's going to win the next election, because we are all always already pre-programmed by our culture. And sort of people in position of power think of, I don't know, Donald Trump, somebody who's supposed to be really powerful. And the analogy that comes to my mind is, you might have read the book Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, right? So Le Petit Prince, right? And there's a king there who orders the stars around. And the reason the king can get away with it is because he never gives orders that the stars will not obey. Like he says, oh, moon, continue in this orbit. Oh yeah, moon, you're doing very well. So, and the idea is that even extremely powerful people, like dictators or like Donald Trump, they have to do what their power base wants them to do. And if, let's say, first of all, again, all sorts of hoops, again, socialization, methods of control. Not anybody can become a president. A president is somebody whom you can rely on not doing the wrong thing. But even if Trump went out of his way and did something completely outrageous from the standpoint of his power base, let's say he would raise the corporate tax. It's a good question. Would he survive in the in the White House until the evening of that day, if he actually went against his power base, which is rich American, wealthy American corporations? And this is kind of the story. And hopefully, by now, we can see how it takes us from protons to presidents. And again, competition between states plays a crucially important role. Every step of the way, I see that I'm sort of having to wrap this up. So basically, this concludes our first pass, our first run from protons to presidents. I hope you can appreciate the story. I hope I've been able to make the story at least somewhat consistent, so you can see on at least some preliminary, superficial level how all of this hangs together. So the next thing that we're going to do, again, in the next couple of classes, is we're going to talk about epistemology. How do we know this stuff, and are there methodological reasons to question it? But then, if you like this kind of thing, this discussion of organic solidarity, mechanical solidarity, worry not, because after 2 classes of epistemology, we're going to spend the rest of the year, sort of talking about this picture again and again and again. And this picture is due to Durkheim, but you will see very similar ideas in Hobbes and in Hegel and in Karl Marx and in Max Weber. So this picture will be with us, and we'll return to it again after 2 classes of intermission. Anyway, I feel that we have run out of time. So thank you, colleagues, very much for your attention. I hope this was interesting and stimulating. If you have any questions, I would be more than happy to answer. Otherwise, thank you so very much, and I'll see you in the seminar.